Well, welcome back. We're discussing trade ties between China and Latin America amid global trade tension. Still with us, Wenyuan Wu is author of the new book, Chinese Oil Enterprises in Latin America. Mauricio Santoro is a professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Haibin Niu is with the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, and Eric Farnsworth is vice president of the Council of the Americas. And Eric, let me start with you. And if we look at the impact that this trade dispute between China and the United States is having around the world, both sides have imposed tariffs on each other. China has retaliated. If we look at the Chinese retaliation, it's been very targeted, very focused, let's say, on U.S. farmers, soybean imports into China. Does this give an opportunity, like Brazil, for instance, to expand its exports to China? As we heard Mauricio tell us, that's one of its main exports.
Well, I think it clearly does, and I think the Chinese retaliation is clearly political in nature, designed to impact or hurt, if you will, economically some of the sectors that may be perceived to be more supportive of the Trump administration. And so there is a political component here. My own preference, of course, is that both the United States and China stand down from the tariff war. I don't think trade battles ever end well. And because these are two massive economies in the global environment, it is having an impact, broadly speaking, around the world. And it's probably not entirely positive. But in terms of the question that you're posing, sure, there are opportunities for countries in South America, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, some of the major commodities exporters, particularly in terms of soy and agricultural products. China is going to continue to need to import those products, and it's going to be looking for suppliers who can do so on a cost-effective basis. There is a limit, a natural limit, in terms of how much product can actually be sourced out of South America, just in terms of land and in terms of production. Right. And there are also some bottlenecks from infrastructure and roads, ports, things like that, in order to get the product in sufficient quantity from South America to China. Those are being worked on, and they have improved over time. The other thing I should say, though, is that once these supplier relationships are established, they're difficult to break. And so I think the opportunity for China, and frankly for Brazil, Argentina, the countries of South America in particular, is to develop those supplier relationships, because presumably the trade war between the U.S. and China is going to be reduced or end, and again, hopefully soon. But once those supply relationships are established, they're difficult to break. And so even if the trade war ends, the supply relationships will continue. So this is a medium to longer term opportunity as well for South American countries, and I think they can be looking at it in that perspective as well.
And if those relationships remain, it comes at some cost then to the United States?
Well, it certainly could, because presumably the reason why the U.S. has been supplying is because it's the low-cost supplier to China. And so it would have to find new markets to be able to do that. There will be transaction and transition costs, and yeah, that's going to increase prices.
Wenyuan, to what extent if we look at the imposition of U.S. tariffs and then the Chinese retaliation, to what extent are both sides looking at their strategic, maybe political interests as well? We did have the former U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, warn Latin American countries not to rely on China too much.
It's absolutely true that it seems that for years, both D.C. and Beijing are operating in completely different normative universes when it comes to engaging with Latin America. So for China, Xi Jinping always insists that China is there for win-win and is operating under the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Whereas the current American mindset of international competition is one that reflects the zero-sum game. It's important to recognize that Beijing does not operate by this rhetoric. Beijing's approach to cooperate with Latin America is more pragmatic, and so far its multilateral approach has been well received by Latin American countries. This April, China became for the first time, became an official observer to the Summit of Americas. It was also the first time when the U.S. president did not attend this summit. And also, there is certainly a political dimension to it. In this March, China built a $50 million station and space and satellite station in Argentina's Patagonia, shortly after Washington, D.C. built emergency response center in the same region.
Mauricio, we have many Latin American countries that have signed free trade agreements with other countries. In fact, I don't think there's any other region in the world which has more free trade agreements than Latin America. Will these free trade agreements insulate the countries of Latin America from this trade dispute that we're seeing right now?
Well, I don't think so, because in many cases, like Mexico and Chile, for example, where the champions of free trade in Latin America, they are also big trade partners of the United States and China. In the case of Mexico, because of NAFTA and because of the migration crisis, the relationship is even closer. So it's going to affect us in Latin America one way or the other. And actually, that's one of the lessons that we learned from the last financial crisis at the end of the last decade. In the beginning, it seemed that Latin America wouldn't be so affected, but after a couple of years, the crisis hit us in a very hard way. In Brazil, we're still trying to recover from that. And I think that in the world of today, no country is isolated, and everybody is interlinked. It's a global interdependent economy. And somehow, in Latin America, we must find a way to deal with this global trade war. It's a bad thing for us as well.
Haibin Niu, how diverse is China's relationship with Latin America? Is it just confined to trade, to business, or is there more to it? Are we seeing expanding contacts in other sectors as well?
I think China has trying very hard to develop a comprehensive relationship with the region, not only focus on the economic side. But first of all, I think the economic side cooperation is the most developed area for cooperation. It has developed a very comprehensive economic relationship, including the equal development of the trade, investment, and the finance. But beyond that, I think China has developed other aspects, like try to develop the cooperation in terms of the global governance, because both Latin America and China face some similar challenges in trying to deal with the climate change, to achieve the sustainable development, social inclusive growth. There are many similar challenges for both sides. They are trying to share their development experiences, and also to have more dialogues on how to deal with this kind of challenges in the global system. Try to make the WTO system work, to make the Paris Agreement work. A lot of this kind of things on the table. And also on the political side, I think both sides are trying to have more dialogue, and also to promote the exchange of the young scholars, politicians, to exchange their views, to have more knowledge about each other. I think this is quite important for a healthy relationship between China and Latin America in the long run.
Eric, you know, when President Trump first announced these tariffs against Chinese imports, President Xi Jinping of China said that there could be no winners in a trade war. But could Latin America be the exception? Could Latin America emerge as a winner here?
It's a tough question to answer. I mean, I think in some products from some countries, they could, quote unquote, benefit, at least in the short term. But I think over the longer term, what the other guests are saying, I agree with. I mean, over the longer term, there aren't any winners, because you know, international trade is based on supply chains, and it's based on cost of production. It's based on all kinds of different things. And the way that the trade patterns have developed to this point are done so in particular because of efficiencies and things like that. So if the trade system currently, as we know it, is being disrupted, it's going to be disrupted into presumably something that's less efficient, that's more atomized regionally, and that's probably not a good thing, or I would say it's not a good thing. And so Latin America is clearly part of that. The other thing is Latin America's share of trade in the global economy is actually smaller than one would anticipate given the size of Latin America geographically and also in terms of GDP. And so Latin America is going to, by definition, going to have to react to some of the changes that are happening rather than being in a position to influence them or even determine them. And so they are in some ways at the mercy of what happens between the U.S. and China. Again, I emphasize it's not every country affected in the same way. It's not every product or sector affected in the same way. There could be winners, there could be losers. But I think at the end of the day, the answer here is not to see who can win in a short-term trade battle. It's to try to stop the trade battle and find a way for the United States and China to come to an accommodation to meet the interests of the other countries.
Wenyuan, what is your view on this? Could Latin America emerge as a winner? Oh, if you look at the balance sheet, I mean, would Latin America be a net winner?
I have to agree with Eric that this is a tough question, but I would like to add that in the short term, in the current environment of rising commodity prices, Latin American natural resource exporters are actually seeing improvements in terms of trade volume. So in 2017, Latin American producers saw for the first time in the last 5 years their trade deficits with China eased to 0.7% of the GDP. I expect that these countries will see further improvements in terms of trade income with China in the foreseeable future. And also, when we look at the trade patterns between China and Latin America, I think that the patterns reflect more of the law of complementarities and comparative advantage. In terms of infrastructure investment and other types of investments, we're also seeing more diversified Chinese profiles than trade. So in the short run, I think that a lot of Latin American countries will come out as winners. And ultimately, it is up to Latin American governments and their civil society organizations to mitigate the adverse effects of exporting primarily natural resource products.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.